February 1st, 2019. Hull, England. A bitter wind blew in off the River Hull, cutting through the streets and making the cold feel like it seeped straight into your bones. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, flickering in the darkness. Most students were already inside by then, warm and unaware of what was about to happen. At 12:09 a.m., CCTV captures a young woman walking down Beverly Road, barefoot, her coat hanging open, moving in a way that seemed confused, unsteady. She wasn't dressed for the freezing night. That woman was Libby Squire. By morning, she would be gone. Before she became a headline, before her name was spoken in courtrooms and news studios, Libby Squire was just a daughter who called home often, a friend who overthought her texts, a student trying to figure out her place in the world. She grew up in High Wycombe, Buckinghamshire, in a close, supportive family. Her parents, Lisa and Russ, described her as thoughtful and deeply empathetic, someone who felt things intensely and cared quietly but sincerely. She wasn't loud or attention-seeking. She was reflective, curious, the kind of person who would pause in conversation, think about what to say, and then offer something unexpectedly sharp and insightful. That curiosity is part of why she chose philosophy. At the University of Hull, Libby threw herself into big questions: morality, ethics, how societies work, what responsibility we owe to one another. Friends said she loved debating ideas, but never aggressively. She listened first, then challenged gently. She was the student who would linger after class, still thinking about a lecture long after everyone else had left. University life was new, but she embraced it. She lived in a shared house on Wellesley Avenue, a typical red brick terrace, close to campus, close to Beverly Road. It was the kind of place filled with mismatched mugs, takeaway menus on the fridge, and late-night conversations that stretched into the early hours. She had a part-time job, close friends, plans. Like so many students, she was in that in-between stage. No longer a teenager, not quite fully grown up. Independent, but still connected to home. Her parents have said she messaged them often. Little updates, jokes, photos from nights out. There was nothing reckless about her. Nothing that would make you think she was in danger. Friends described her as responsible, even cautious. She wasn't the kind of person who wandered off or put herself at risk. And that's why the footage from that night was so shocking. The woman on CCTV, barefoot, confused, vulnerable, didn't match the Libby her family knew. In the days after she disappeared, as search teams combed fields and divers entered the River Hull, people started learning who Libby really was, not through rumors, but through the memories of those who loved her. They talked about her laugh, quick, bright, and easy. They talked about her kindness, the way she would check in if someone seemed off. They talked about her intelligence, how she could take complicated ideas and make them feel simple, human. Her life wasn't defined by those final hours, replayed frame by frame. It was defined by 21 years of growth, friendships, small joys, and quiet moments that never made the news. And that contrast between who she was and the vulnerability on that footage is what makes this case so hard to shake. Libby wasn't a mystery. The mystery was what happened to her. To understand that, we have to go back to the night of January 31st, a student night out that started like any other and ended in silence. Thursday, January 31st, 2019. For most University of Hull students, it was just another night out. The end of January, exams behind them, a chance to relax before the weekend. Libby spent the evening with friends in the city center. The plan was nothing unusual. A few drinks, some music, a taxi home. Ordinary, predictable, safe. At first, it all went as expected. But as the night went on, her friends noticed that Libby was more intoxicated than usual. Exactly how much she'd had to drink and whether anything else played a role would be examined later. But by late evening, it was clear she was struggling. Club security decided she was too unwell to stay inside. Following standard procedure, they got her into a taxi and sent her home. She left alone. Just before 11:30 p.m., the taxi dropped her near her student house on Wellesley Avenue, a familiar, short walk from campus. Something went wrong between the pavement and the front door. She knocked. She tried the door. But for reasons that would later be painfully discussed, she never got inside. Whether the door was locked, whether she wandered off briefly and returned, or whether confusion had already started to set in, the fact is, she didn't go back in. Instead, she walked away. CCTV later showed her heading toward Beverly Road. From that point, the night began to shift. Over the next 40 minutes, her movements became increasingly erratic. She appeared confused. At one point, she took off her coat and left it on the ground. At another, she lay down briefly on a garden path. She approached passing cars. She asked strangers for help. One motorist stopped and spoke to her, concerned. Another couple later told police they tried to help, even calling emergency services, but Libby walked away before they could reach her. Looking back, her vulnerability is obvious. The temperature was just above freezing. Alcohol impairs judgment. Combine that with exposure to cold, and it can speed up both physical and mental decline. Experts later explained that intoxication can hide the early signs of hypothermia, making someone appear restless, confused, or irrational. But at the time, to drivers and passers-by, she may have looked like any student who'd simply had a bit too much to drink. And that's part of what makes this case so haunting. Vulnerability doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks ordinary. At 12:09 a.m., CCTV captured her barefoot. By 12:20 a.m., she was further down Beverly Road, still alone. The street was alive with blinking traffic lights, passing cars, and the glow of takeaway shops. Then, around 12:29 a.m., a silver Vauxhall Astra appeared in the frame. The driver slowed near her. CCTV would later show the car making repeated passes through the area in the minutes before and after. Moments later, Libby was gone from view. The street went back to normal. But Libby did not. What had started as an ordinary night out had quietly become the final documented hour of her life. At 12:29 a.m., the silver Vauxhall Astra slowed beside Libby on Beverly Road. The driver was 24-year-old Powell Relowich. CCTV later showed his car circling the area multiple times that night, not just passing through, returning, looping back. To anyone reviewing the footage afterward, it didn't look random. Libby, clearly vulnerable, had been approaching cars along that stretch of road. She tried door handles. She asked for help. Some drivers kept going, some stopped briefly. One even called emergency services. Powell stopped and stayed. The cameras captured Libby getting to the front passenger seat of his car. The door closed, the car pulled away. That was the last confirmed sighting of her alive. From that point on, the timeline becomes colder, quieter, built not from eyewitness accounts but from vehicle tracking, CCTV fragments, phone data, and forensic reconstruction. Investigators later traced the Astra through Hull in the early hours of February 1st. The car moved toward isolated areas near the River Hull. Stretches of industrial land and riverside paths, dark and largely empty at night. Prosecutors argued that Powell drove Libby to a secluded spot along the riverbank. What happened next unfolded out of sight. During the trial, the court heard that Libby had been raped before entering the water. The exact sequence, whether she was conscious, whether she was pushed, whether she stumbled into the river trying to escape, was never fully confirmed in public detail. There were no witnesses. No cameras pointed at the river's edge. Only forensic evidence remained. Her body was recovered from the Humber estuary on the 20th of March 2019, about 7 weeks after she went missing. A post-mortem concluded she had drowned, but drowning alone didn't tell the whole story. Inside Powell's car, investigators found fibers matching Libby's clothing. Her DNA was present. The interior had been cleaned. Digital evidence revealed an even darker picture. In the hours and days around her disappearance, Powell had accessed violent pornography, searched topics related to police investigations, deleted data, and tried to obscure his movements. To the jury, it suggested consciousness of guilt. Powell later admitted to picking Libby up, claiming she had willingly entered his vehicle. He denied murder. He denied rape. The prosecution argued that given her condition, intoxicated, confused, barefoot in freezing temperatures, she could not have given meaningful consent. The image of that silver Astra became central to the case, because it represents the narrow window where everything might have been different. A car slows, a door opens, a choice is made, and within minutes, a life slipped beyond the reach of cameras, beyond the reach of help, beyond the reach of everyone who loved her. What happened along the riverbank is only known in fragments, reconstructed through science and surveillance. For Libby, the experience ended in darkness and freezing water. By the morning of February 1st, Libby still hadn't come home. At first, there was confusion. Students sometimes stay over at friends' houses. Phones die, plans change. But as the hours passed, unease turned into alarm. Her friends reported her missing. Humberside police launched one of the largest missing person investigations Hull had ever seen. Officers retraced her last known movements, knocking on doors, collecting CCTV, speaking to taxi drivers, shopkeepers, anyone who might have seen her after leaving the nightclub. Very quickly, Beverly Road became the focus. Investigators gathered hours of footage from traffic cameras, shop fronts, buses, and residential properties. Frame by frame, they reconstructed Libby's final hour on foot. They saw her knocking on her own front door. They saw her walking away. They saw her approaching strangers. And then they saw the silver Vauxhall Astra. The registration plate was traced. The owner, Powell Relowich. He was arrested on February 6th, initially on suspicion of abduction. Officers seized his car. Forensic teams went over it meticulously, vacuuming fibers, swabbing surfaces, scanning for traces invisible to the naked eye. What they found deepened suspicion. Fibers matching Libby's clothing were recovered inside the car. Her DNA was found on surfaces. CCTV showed the Astra heading toward areas near the River Hull shortly after picking her up, roads with no innocent explanation. Meanwhile, the search for Libby intensified. Police divers entered the River Hull despite freezing conditions. Specialist teams scoured fields and industrial estates. Drones scanned the riverbanks from above. Volunteers handed out leaflets across the city. Her photograph ran in national media day after day. Her body was recovered from the Humber estuary on March 20, 2019. Formal identification confirmed it was Libby. The news devastated her family and transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a homicide inquiry. Further forensic analysis supported the prosecution's later case that she had been sexually assaulted before entering the water. Investigators didn't just rely on physical evidence. They examined digital behavior. Powell's phones and devices revealed searches for violent sexual material. In the days after Libby's disappearance, he searched for information about the police investigation. He deleted data, erased traces. To detectives, it wasn't random. It suggested planning, awareness, fear of being caught. In the weeks that followed, Powell was formally charged with rape and murder. But even with the charges, the investigation faced a haunting reality. There were no eyewitnesses to the assault. No camera had captured the riverbank. The case would rely on forensic science, digital evidence, and the careful reconstruction of movements through surveillance. It came down to whether a jury could see the whole picture, and whether they believed that Libby, intoxicated, confused, barefoot in freezing temperatures, had encountered not a stranger offering help, but a predator. More than 2 years after Libby disappeared, the case finally reached a courtroom. In early 2021, proceedings began at Sheffield Crown Court. Pandemic restrictions meant parts of the trial were held under tight controls, social distancing, limited public seating, but inside the room, the emotional weight was palpable. On one side sat Libby's family, on the other sat Powell Relowich. The prosecution's case was careful and methodical. There was no single dramatic piece of evidence, no confession, no eyewitness. Instead, jurors were asked to consider the accumulation, the quiet stacking of facts that together formed a narrative. CCTV showed Powell's silver Astra circling Beverly Road repeatedly before stopping near Libby. The timing was precise, the movements deliberate. Footage then tracked the car heading toward a remote riverside area shortly after she entered. Forensic experts testified that fibers matching Libby's clothing were found inside the Astra. Her DNA was recovered from areas consistent with sexual contact. Evidence suggested the interior had been cleaned. Digital analysts described Powell's online activity. They outlined his access to violent pornography in the days surrounding the attack. They detailed searches made after Libby vanished, focused on police investigations and media coverage. The prosecution argued that Libby, severely intoxicated and disoriented, could not legally or meaningfully consent. They told the jury that Powell recognized her vulnerability and exploited it. The defense did not deny that Libby entered the car. Powell admitted to picking her up, but he claimed the encounter was consensual. He denied rape. He denied murder. He suggested Libby had left the vehicle of her own accord. Prosecutors challenged that account, pointing to the river location, the forensic findings, and the absence of any credible evidence showing she was seen alive after getting into his car. Some of the most powerful moments in court came not from testimony, but from silence. From the playback of CCTV showing Libby in her final hour, Jurors watched her barefoot in the freezing night, watched her stumble, watched her disappear from view. After weeks of evidence and deliberation, the jury returned its verdict in February 2021. Guilty of rape. Guilty of murder. Powell was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years before he can be considered for parole. In sentencing, the judge described Libby as a young woman with everything to live for and called the attack predatory. For Libby's family, the verdict brought accountability, but not closure. Libby's death sparked conversations across the UK about student safety, vulnerability, and violence against women. After Powell was sentenced to life with a minimum term of 27 years, her family began establishing initiatives focused on kindness and awareness. They've spoken publicly about the need for change in society, not fear. They refuse to let Libby be remembered only for the worst night of her life. Instead, they talk about her intelligence, her compassion, her sense of humor. They remember the daughter they lost. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in real investigations, shocking cases, and justice served, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us as we explore more true crime stories.